The alarm klaxon shrieked across the drone operations center, a metallic howl that drilled straight into every skull. Red and amber warning lights strobed on the massive tactical display. The Predator's telemetry scrolled in a frantic blur. Engine power plummeting, hydraulics, failing altitude, bleeding away like water through open fingers. Flight controls are unresponsive, the contracted pilot shouted, his voice cracking over the intercom. Stabilize her now, Major Paul Richter barked, his tone a mix of panic and command, but the numbers on the screen didn't care. The UAV was in a death spiral thousands of miles away, yet seconds from virtual impact. Near the back of the room, Captain Sarah Kade didn't move. She stood with her arms loosely folded, her eyes locked on the chaos playing out on the main monitor. She was the only person in the room not speaking, not gesturing, not radiating panic. Richter spun toward her. Captain, in case you missed the obvious, this is not an observation exercise anymore. Stay out of the way unless you are here to take notes. His voice carried sharp and deliberate, making sure the analysts and junior officers clustered along the wall heard every syllable. Someone snickered quietly. Others smirked behind their screens. Richter had been doing this all morning, using the unassuming officer in the back as his personal punchline. She hadn't fired back once into the room. That silence meant weakness. But Richter didn't know Sarah Kade. Not yet. The moment held for a beat longer tension, thick as corded steel between them. Then Sarah's gaze slid from the dying telemetry to the wind profile data on the secondary screen. Her fingers flexed once, a subtle readiness. The simulation had been flawless until 5 minutes ago. The scenario, a high-stakes recon mission over hostile mountain terrain, was Richter's design, meant to test his team's coordination under pressure. Kade's role officially was administrative liaison. She was supposed to be here to observe and report on procedural efficiency. In Richter's mind, she was a glorified clerk wearing a flight suit, someone who'd never had to make a life or death call in the air. Sarah hadn't corrected him. She rarely corrected anyone. The truth was buried in classified files and redacted after-action reports. Missions flown at altitudes most pilots never saw, the landings made on runways that barely existed. Years of experience had taught her that real skill didn't need to advertise itself. The only people who needed to know already knew, and Richter, she decided, was about to join that list. Outside, the simulated Predator was in free fall, the virtual terrain rushing up to claim it. The pilot's hands shook on the controls. Richter was barking contradictory orders, now a man drowning in his own scenario. Sarah took one step forward, then another. Move, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. The room was quiet in the way only real trouble makes it, no one breathing too loudly, no chair scraping against the floor. Every eye was locked on the big screen, where the Predator's nose had begun its slow, merciless drop toward the jagged digital ridgelines below. Red warning banners flashed across the telemetry. Hydraulics fail. Engine RPM critical. Control link lost. The sound of the alarms was a steady, high-pitched wail, shrill enough to get inside a man's skull and rattle it. Flight controls are unresponsive, the contracted pilot said, his voice pitched high with the effort to stay calm. His hands worked the stick and throttle, but the readings didn't change. The Predator was going where gravity told it to go, and nothing he did seemed to matter. Major Paul Richter leaned over the console, his jaw tight. Cycle the system. Reboot your channels. His tone was sharp, but carried no real direction, just noise meant to fill the space where a plan ought to be. The pilot shook his head, his eyes locked on the altitude counter that was spinning down like the hand of a broken clock. We're not getting it back. Engines spooling down to 0. She's dead in the air. That word dead seemed to hit the room like a cold wind. This wasn't a scenario anyone had rehearsed for. The failure wasn't part of the script. Someone somewhere in the chain of command had injected this into the exercise without telling Richter. A real test buried inside a pretend one, and it was doing exactly what it was designed to do, show who could think when the bottom fell out. Richter straightened, and the lines around his mouth deepened. Level her out. Keep her up as long as you can. Don't let her nose drop past. He broke off as the pitch indicator slid straight through his red line. The Predator's camera view rolled, showing nothing but the jagged slope of a mountainside rushing up to meet it. Give me manual override, Richter snapped. and when the pilot didn't move fast enough, he stepped toward the controls like he was going to take the seat himself. That's when Sarah Kade spoke. "Sir," she said evenly, "you're making it worse." It wasn't loud, but it cut through the alarms and the tension like a scalpel. Richter turned toward her, his face flushed. "Captain, unless you've got some miracle tucked into your flight suit, I suggest you stand down and let my team handle." The Predator's nose twitched on screen, a small strange motion that didn't belong in a clean systems failure. Sarah had seen it before. Years ago in a real sky with real metal under her, and the smell of burning fuel in her lungs. She stepped forward, her boots sounding unnaturally loud on the polished floor. "Move," she said again, this time to the pilot. There was no threat in it, no anger, just the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly what came next. The contractor looked up at her and saw something in her eyes that made him unclip his harness without another word. Sarah slid into the seat, her hands settling on the controls like they belonged there. She didn't waste a breath asking for permission. Her fingers moved in a calm, deliberate sequence, rerouting auxiliary power through an obscure circuit path, bypassing dead relays, coaxing just enough whisper of control to shape the fall. The Predator was still dropping, but it was no longer tumbling. Behind her, Richter was frozen, caught between ordering her to stop and realizing she was the only one in the room who understood what was happening. The younger analyst leaned forward unconsciously, as if distance alone could get them closer to whatever it was she was doing. Sarah adjusted the flaps not to climb, but to bleed speed in a controlled glide. The textbooks would call it impossible. She'd called it something else years ago over Afghanistan, the only chance you've got. Altitude 2,500 feet. Speed dropping towards stall range. Distance to flat terrain. Barely enough for one shot. Her voice was steady when she spoke, not to Richter, but to herself. "Hold the nose. Feel the air." The Predator's camera feed steadied its nose, now lining up with a long, empty stretch of desert floor. She feathered the flaps, flared at just the right second, and the landing gear made contact in a cloud of dust that filled the screen. The bird rolled, slowed, and came to a stop with its wings still level. No bounce, no breakup. The only sound in the room was the steady tone of the system declaring the simulation complete. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the junior officers whispered almost to himself, "No way. Nobody can do that." Sarah stood, handed the pilot's headset back, and smoothed the front of her flight suit as if she'd just finished a routine check. Her eyes found Richter's, and for the first time all day he had nothing to say. He'd seen it now, the quiet, exact confidence that only comes from the kind of hours you don't brag about and the kind of landings no one ever forgets. The exercise might have been simulated, but the way she'd handled it was as real as it gets. And somewhere deep in his pride, Richter knew he'd just been outflown by a woman he'd spent the whole morning underestimating. Sarah's hands moved the way an old craftsman handles his tools, without wasted motion, without doubt. Every input she gave the controls was deliberate, measured, and calm. The chaos in the room didn't touch her. It might as well have been happening in another world. She didn't fight the failure. She shaped it. With the Predator's main engine dead and hydraulics gone, she coaxed life from the one thing still working: physics. She rerouted residual power from secondary circuits to the minimal control surfaces still responsive. A tiny flicker of authority returned to the ailerons, just enough to stop the roll. She feathered the flaps not to climb, but to manage her glide path. Every change was small, but in a powerless aircraft, small was the difference between controlled descent and catastrophic freefall. No one in the room spoke. Even the alarm, still wailing in the background, seemed distant now. The junior officers leaned forward, watching her fingers more than the screen. Richter stood behind her, silent, jaw tight buttoned, as if speaking might somehow break the fragile thread she was weaving between disaster and survival. Altitude dropped past 1,800 feet. Sarah banked slightly, trading the last bit of altitude for alignment with a long, flat stretch of simulated desert. To the untrained eye, it looked reckless, a gamble with no margin. To her, it was the only path to a survivable landing. She adjusted for a crosswind most people wouldn't have noticed, angling the nose just enough to compensate. "Hold. Steady," she murmured under her breath, almost as if the Predator could hear her. At 200 feet, she eased back on the stick, bleeding off speed, letting the air cradle the aircraft instead of fighting it. For years, this had been her element, the space between control and chaos, where instinct mattered more than manuals. It wasn't about thinking faster. It was about feeling the machine, trusting the subtle cues no instrument could measure. 600 feet. She began her flare early, knowing the predator's sluggish response time without hydraulics. The desert floor rose in the camera feed wide and empty. 200 feet. A final micro-adjustment on the flaps. The wail of alarms cut sharply as the system recognized touchdown parameters. The predator kissed the ground, not a crash, not even a stumble, just a clean level contact. It rolled across the flat expanse, dust blooming behind it, and slowed naturally until it stopped in perfect alignment. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The simulator's digital dust hung on the big screen like a photograph. The alarms fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of cooling electronics. It was Major Richter who finally broke the stillness, though his voice had none of its earlier sharpness. How in the hell? He didn't finish the thought. The words trailed away as he realized there was nothing he could add that wouldn't sound foolish. Sarah unbuckled the harness and rose from the seat. No triumphant smile, no glance around for acknowledgement. She simply placed the headset on the console and stepped aside. Her eyes swept once over the readings as if confirming to herself that the job was finished, and then she turned toward the pilot who'd been in the chair before her. "System's safe. You can run post-flight checks," she said quietly. The contractor nodded, still looking at her like he'd just seen a magician pull a tank out of a hat. Around the room, the younger officers exchanged glances that carried equal parts disbelief and respect. They'd been told such a maneuver was virtually impossible, the kind of thing you read about in obscure aviation manuals as a theoretical footnote. And yet here it was done in front of their eyes with the kind of precision that made it look effortless. Richter remained silent, and Sarah didn't wait for him to find his voice. She walked to the back of the room, retrieved the clipboard she'd set down earlier, and checked a box on the after-action report. Her penmanship was steady, almost neat to a fault. General Thorne had been standing quietly near the wall the entire time. Now he stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He looked not at the screen, but at her hands steady, unshaken. The kind of hands he'd seen only a handful of times in his career. "Captain," he said, finally his tone softer than expected, "that was one of the cleanest dead stick landings I've ever seen. And I've seen more than a few." Sarah only inclined her head slightly. The aircraft still had something to work with. You just have to know where to look. The general's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Those weren't the words of someone who'd read about the maneuver in a classroom. Those were the words of someone who had lived it, someone who'd learned the hard way at altitude with no reset button, waiting if they got it wrong. Richter glanced between them, clearly unsettled by the exchange. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but Thorne's raised hand silenced him. The general didn't press Sarah for details. Not yet. But in that moment, the air in the room shifted. The exercise wasn't just over, it had been transformed into something else entirely. What had started as a simulation now felt like a piece of living history. The younger analysts didn't know the term for it yet, but the old-timers did. It was the quiet arrival of a standard. A benchmark they'd measure themselves against from now on, whether they realized it or not. Sarah Kade had just raised that standard without a single boast or a wasted word. And for those who understood, that was worth more than any medal. General Marcus Hale's gaze lingered on Sarah Kade a moment longer than anyone else realized. It wasn't her face he was studying, it was her right hand as she held the clipboard. The lighting from the monitor caught on a small, dark band around her fourth finger. Not gold, not silver, not decorative. Polished titanium burnished smooth with time, carrying a faint patina that told of both age and significance. A Reaper ring. Hale knew exactly what it meant. You didn't earn one in a classroom or in a simulator or by logging hours in good weather. It was awarded only to the few pilots who had brought a crippled aircraft home after total engine failure in real combat, dead stick, no power, no second chances. The ring was forged from the turbine blade of the downed engine. They'd saved a quiet badge of survival and mastery. And he also knew there were fewer than 24 Reaper rings in existence. Seeing one in the wild was like spotting a relic thought lost to history. The general stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his boots sounding against the tile. The room, already quiet, seemed to hold its breath. He stopped in front of Sarah, his eyes locking briefly with hers before shifting back to that ring. "Major Richter," he said, his voice even, but edged with steel. "Pull up Captain Kade's personnel record." On the main screen, Richter hesitated. "Sir, That wasn't a request, Major." Keys clacked reluctantly. The massive display, which moments before had shown the still frame of the Predator on the simulated desert floor, now lit with Sarah Kade's file. Line by line, her career unfolded in black and white. Call sign Ghost. Flight hours 4200, over half in active combat zones. Unit 732nd Expeditionary Attack Squadron. Decorations, 3 distinguished flying crosses. The Air Medal with Valor. Commendations from 2 allied nations. Citation redacted. Corangle Valley operation, complete engine failure at 20,000 feet. Damage to primary control surfaces. Enemy fire in AO. Successful dead stick landing of an F-16 on an unprepared forward strip. All crew survived. The younger officers stared eyes wide. Even the civilian contractors leaned in, reading every line as though it were an unfolding legend. Hale let the record speak for itself for a long moment before he turned back toward Richter. "Major, you've been in the Air Force long enough to know the value of judgment under pressure. And yet today you question out loud the competence of a pilot who has stared down more in a single sortie than most see in a career." Richter swallowed, his earlier bravado shriveled into silence. "Your job," Major Hale continued, his voice dropping into the low register that could cut deeper than any shout, "is to count the spears. Her job is to throw them, and she's thrown more than you will ever hold in your hand." Hale turned back to Sarah. His expression softened, not to kindness exactly, but to the weighty respect soldiers offer only to those who've proved themselves beyond all doubt. Then he did something rare. He raised his right hand to his brow and delivered a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the crisp, perfunctory motion of formality. It was the kind that carried history in it, one warrior to another, recognition between equals. Sarah returned the salute with the same quiet precision she had shown in everything else. No smile, no nod. Just a simple exchange of respect that said more than any words could. The general let his hand drop. "From this day forward," he said, turning to address the room, "the maneuver you witnessed will be the new standard in our advanced drone operations syllabus. It will be known as the Kade Challenge." A murmur rippled among the gathered personnel, not disbelief now, but something closer to reverence. They all understood the implication. This wasn't just about a simulator victory. This was about anchoring their training to the highest proven level of skill, to an example that had been tested in the real world and had survived. In the back, one of the younger officers leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "We'll never live up to that." His colleague shook his head. "Maybe not, but now we know what it looks like." Richter, to his credit, said nothing. He simply stood at attention, the lesson carved deep into his posture. Hale gave Sarah one last nod, then turned to leave. The room didn't move until he was gone. Only then did the low hum of conversation return, but now it was different, measured, respectful. Sarah placed the clipboard back on the console and quietly stepped out, leaving behind the faint echo of bootsteps and a story that would outlast the day. The photograph of the Predator on the desert floor was saved and printed within hours, pinned to the main bulletin board without caption. Everyone already knew the name attached to it. And in the weeks that followed, when the new class of recruits entered that operations center, they'd see that photograph and hear the story. Not from Sarah, she never told it herself, but from those who'd watched it happen. It was how legends began. Not in the telling, but in the remembering. By the next morning, the story of Sarah Kade's impossible landing had already made its way into every corner of the base. Not as gossip, but as something quieter, more enduring. The way the men and women spoke about it, you could hear it in their tone, less like they were recounting a training exercise, and more like they were recalling a moment that shifted how they saw the world. The photograph of the Predator, resting intact on the simulated desert floor, was printed in high resolution and tacked to the central bulletin board. No caption, no rank, no date, just the image. It didn't need an explanation. Anyone who walked past it and asked would hear the same story told with the same detail, because every witness had memorized it like scripture. The younger recruits began calling it the day the room went quiet. It became a touchstone during training. When tempers flared, when voices got too loud, someone would nod toward the photo and say, "Remember the Cade challenge?" That was enough to bring the temperature down. Sarah never added to the story. She never gave speeches about composure under pressure or wrote a memo about the importance of staying calm. Her actions that day were her only statement, and they said everything that needed saying. She showed without a single boast that mastery doesn't need a microphone. It was the older hands, the sergeants, the warrant officers, the ones with weathered flight jackets who understood it most. They'd seen too many people talk themselves into trouble, too many leaders confuse volume with authority. They recognized in Sarah what they had learned the hard way: real skill is quiet because it's busy working. For the rest of her time on that base, people treated her differently. Not with fanfare, but with a small nod in the hallway, a seat saved at the table, a silence when she chose to speak. And when she moved on to her next assignment, the photograph stayed behind untouched. There's a lesson here worth carrying beyond the gates of any base. In life, just like in the cockpit, noise doesn't keep you in the air, skill does. And the people you underestimate today might be the ones who save you tomorrow. If you believe that quiet mastery speaks louder than arrogance, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more true accounts where silent strength proves its worth, subscribe and join us again. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't shouted from the rooftops, they're earned in the calm between the storms.